The warm amber glow of oil lamps cast long shadows across the parlor walls of the Morton family home. Outside, a gentle autumn rain tapped against the leaded glass windows of the stately Victorian structure that had stood proudly on Willow Street for nearly 3 decades. The air hung heavy with the scent of lilies and formaldehyde, a somber cocktail that filled the nostrils of every mourner who passed through the ornately carved front door. The polished grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4 with a solemn resonance that seemed to echo the gravity of the occasion. The year was 1911, and death was no stranger to the small town of Ravenwood. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and various fevers claimed lives with alarming regularity in these parts. But the passing of Eleanor Morton had cast a particularly dark shadow over the community. At 32, she had been the picture of grace and beauty, beloved by all who knew her. Her sudden illness and subsequent passing had left the town in shock. Just 2 weeks prior, she had been organizing the autumn charity ball, her laughter filling the meeting room of the Ladies' Aid Society as they finalized the decorations. Now she lay in a casket of polished mahogany, its brass fixtures gleaming dully in the subdued light. Thomas Morton stood beside his wife's casket, his tall frame slightly stooped with grief. His black suit was impeccably tailored, as befitting his station as the town's most prominent banker. The watch chain draped across his waistcoat had been a gift from Eleanor on their 10th wedding anniversary, just 8 months ago. Yet his usual commanding presence seemed diminished today, his eyes hollow with loss as he accepted condolences from a steady stream of townspeople. The constant murmur of "my deepest sympathies" and "she's with the angels now" had begun to blur together, a meaningless hum that did nothing to fill the void Eleanor's passing had left in his heart. "She looks so peaceful," whispered Mrs. Abernathy, an elderly neighbor who had known Eleanor since she was a child. Her wrinkled hands clutched a lace handkerchief, dabbing occasionally at rheumy eyes, like she might just be sleeping. Thomas nodded mechanically, having heard this same sentiment countless times throughout the day. It was what people said when confronted with death, a comforting lie they told themselves to ease the cold finality of what lay before them. The mortician had done his work well. Death appeared as nothing more than a serene slumber. But Thomas knew better. He had been there during those final hours, had held Eleanor's hand as the fever raged through her body, had watched as her breathing grew shallower until, finally, it seemed to stop altogether. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Abernathy," he managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Eleanor always spoke fondly of your Sunday afternoon teas." The old woman patted his arm. "She was the daughter I never had," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "Heaven has gained a true angel." Eleanor did indeed look peaceful. The mortician, Mr. Calloway, had done his work with exceptional skill. Her golden hair was arranged in an elegant updo, framing a face that retained much of its beauty, even in death. The fever's flush had been masked with powder, returning her complexion to the porcelain quality she had maintained in life through careful avoidance of the sun. She wore her favorite dress of midnight blue silk, the one she had worn to the governor's ball last winter. Her hands crossed delicately over a small Bible, a single pearl necklace adorning her throat. The pearls had been her mother's, passed down when Eleanor married Thomas 12 years ago. "The children are taking it as well as can be expected," Thomas replied to another mourner's inquiry, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret hasn't spoken since it happened. And little James keeps asking when his mother will wake up." At 10, Margaret was old enough to understand the permanence of death, but the shock had rendered her mute. 4-year-old James, with his mother's golden curls and innocent blue eyes, still believed his mother was simply taking an unusually long nap. Each morning, he would ask if today was the day she would wake up. Each morning, Thomas had to watch his son's face crumple with disappointment when told that Mama would never wake up again. Mrs. Abernathy placed a sympathetic hand on his arm. "Time heals all wounds, Thomas. You must be strong for them now." Her words were well-intentioned but rang hollow in his ears. How could time possibly heal this? How could anything ever be right again in a world without Eleanor's laugh, without her gentle touch, without the scent of lavender that always seemed to follow her through the rooms of their home? As the day wore on, the parlor filled with more visitors. Businessmen who worked with Thomas at the bank, ladies from Eleanor's charitable society, the minister and his wife, the mayor and his family, all coming to pay their respects before tomorrow's funeral service. The quiet murmur of conversation, punctuated by occasional sobs, created a somber rhythm that matched the steady drumming of rain outside. The scent of flowers grew stronger as more arrangements arrived, until the sweet, cloying smell became almost overpowering. In the corner of the room, barely noticed by the mourners, stood a man with a large camera on a tripod. Sebastian Hart had been hired to photograph the funeral, a common practice among families of means in 1911. Death photography served as a final remembrance, a way to preserve the image of a loved one before they were committed to the earth forever. In an age where photographs were still relatively uncommon in many households, these final images often became treasured family heirlooms, the last tangible evidence of a beloved face. Sebastian worked quietly, adjusting his equipment with practiced hands. At 35, he had been Ravenwood's only professional photographer for nearly a decade, documenting everything from weddings to christenings to funerals. With his somber demeanor and respectful manner, he had become the natural choice for such occasions. He had photographed the dead more times than he cared to remember, his camera capturing the still faces of those who had passed on to whatever lay beyond. Children taken by diphtheria, young men claimed by industrial accidents, elderly citizens who had simply reached the end of their allotted time. Sebastian had documented them all, providing families with a final image to remember their loved ones by. But something about this particular assignment unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite define. Perhaps it was the youth of the deceased, or the palpable grief that hung in the air like a physical presence. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he adjusted the focus on his camera, he found his eyes repeatedly drawn to Eleanor's face. There was something about her expression that seemed different from the other deceased individuals he had photographed over the years. Not peace exactly, but something more complex, as if even in death, some essential part of her remained present. Sebastian shook off the fanciful thought. Death was death, and his job was simply to document it with dignity and skill. He had known Eleanor Morton casually, as most people in Ravenwood did. She had sat for a family portrait just 6 months ago, a vibrant, laughing woman who had teased her husband and coaxed smiles from her children with gentle humor. The contrast between that lively presence and the still form in the casket was jarring, a stark reminder of how quickly life could be extinguished. As the mourners began to thin out in the early evening, Sebastian approached the casket to take the photographs the family had requested. Thomas stood nearby, watching with hollow eyes as the photographer arranged his equipment. "I'll need several minutes of complete stillness for the exposure, Mr. Morton," Sebastian explained softly. "The light is poor, and I want to ensure the highest quality image. Would you prefer to remain present, or shall I call you when I'm finished?" Thomas glanced at his wife's still form, then looked away quickly. "I think I'll check on the children. Margaret's governess says she still hasn't spoken a word, and I worry for her. Please let me know when you're done." Sebastian nodded sympathetically. "Of course, sir. Take all the time you need with your family. I'll ensure everything is handled with the utmost respect." Left alone with the deceased, Sebastian went about his work methodically. He had learned long ago not to dwell too much on the humanity of his subjects in these moments. It was simply a job to be done, a service to provide. He adjusted the lighting, ensuring that the oil lamps cast the most flattering glow on Eleanor's face, then positioned his camera carefully. The large wooden camera was state-of-the-art, expensive equipment that represented years of saving and investment. Photography was still something of a marvel in rural communities like Ravenwood, and Sebastian took pride in bringing this modern technology to his neighbors and friends, even in moments of sorrow. He ducked beneath the black cloth at the back of his camera, focusing the lens with precision. Through the viewfinder, Eleanor's face appeared magnified, every detail crisp and clear. Sebastian held his breath as he prepared to trigger the shutter, a practice that helped prevent any movement that might blur the image during the long exposure time. That's when he saw it, a movement so subtle it could have been a trick of the light. Eleanor's right eyelid. Had it flickered? Sebastian froze, his finger hovering over the shutter release. "Impossible," he muttered to himself, peering more intently through the viewfinder. There it was again, the faintest tremor of an eyelid, like the wing of a butterfly testing the air before flight. Sebastian pulled back from the camera with a sharp intake of breath. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stared at the woman in the casket. From this distance, she appeared perfectly still, perfectly dead. The rational part of his mind insisted that what he'd seen was nothing more than a shadow cast by the flickering oil lamps, or perhaps a product of his own fatigue after a long day of work. He stepped closer, his professional demeanor crumbling as he scrutinized Eleanor's face. Her skin was pale, her lips colorless. No visible rise and fall of her chest indicated breathing. By all appearances, she was exactly what she was supposed to be, a corpse. "I'm seeing things," Sebastian whispered to himself, rubbing his eyes with the heels of his hands. Too many hours in poor light. The Morton household had been his third funeral assignment that week. The strain was clearly taking a toll on his nerves and his vision. Determined to complete his task, he returned to his camera. Once again, he ducked beneath the cloth, focused the lens, and prepared to capture the image. And once again, through the magnified view of his lens, he saw Eleanor's eyelid tremble. This time, Sebastian could not dismiss it as imagination. With trembling hands, he abandoned his camera and hurried to find Thomas Morton. He found the banker in the nursery, sitting beside his son's bed. Little James had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by grief he was too young to fully comprehend. Thomas was reading a storybook aloud, though the child was no longer awake to hear it. A father desperately clinging to routine in a world suddenly turned upside down. "Mr. Morton," Sebastian said, his voice strained with urgency, "I need you to come with me immediately." Thomas looked up, confusion replacing the vacant grief in his eyes. "What is it? Is something wrong? Has something happened to the arrangements?" He couldn't bring himself to say body or casket, as if putting those words to his wife would make her death even more real. I'm not entirely certain, sir, but I believe there's something you need to see." Sebastian's tone conveyed the gravity of the situation, and Thomas rose immediately, placing the book aside. "Mrs. Winters?" He addressed the nursemaid sitting in the corner. "Please stay with James. I'll return shortly." Reluctantly, Thomas followed the photographer back to the parlor. The room was empty now, save for the silent form in the casket and the lingering scent of flowers and grief. The rain had intensified outside, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the room through the windows, creating strange, shifting shadows. "What am I looking for, Mr. Hart?" Thomas asked, his voice tinged with impatience born of exhaustion and sorrow. Sebastian gestured toward his camera. "Look through here, sir. Watch her eyes. Specifically, her right eyelid." Thomas gave him a look that suggested he thought the photographer had lost his mind, but he complied nonetheless, bending to peer through the viewfinder. The storm chose that moment to intensify, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rumbled in the distance. The oil lamps flickered in the sudden draft. Long seconds passed in silence. Then Thomas straightened abruptly, his face ashen. "This is some kind of cruel joke," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No, sir. I swear to you it's not," Sebastian replied earnestly. "I've seen it 3 times now. There's definitely movement." Thomas approached the casket slowly, as if drawn by an invisible force. He gazed down at his wife's face, searching for any sign of life. In the unstable light of the flickering lamps, shadows danced across her features, but she remained perfectly still. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" The room remained silent save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the persistent patter of rain against the windows. Eleanor's face showed no response, no hint of the movement Sebastian had observed through his camera lens. "We need to fetch Dr. Wilson," Sebastian said firmly. Immediately, Thomas seemed rooted to the spot, unable to tear his eyes away from his wife's face. "She's been declared dead. The doctor already examined her. The death certificate is signed. The funeral is—" His voice trailed off, unable to complete the sentence. "With all due respect, Mr. Morton, I know what I saw, and now you've seen it too. If there's even the slightest chance that Mrs. Morton is still alive, we cannot afford to wait." That seemed to break Thomas from his trance. He strode to the bell pull and yanked it hard, summoning the butler. "Higgins, send for Dr. Wilson at once. Tell him it's an emergency of the gravest nature, and have the carriage brought around immediately in case the telephone lines are affected by the storm." The butler's eyes widened slightly at the urgency in his employer's voice, but he simply nodded and departed swiftly. Years of service had taught him that certain questions were not his place to ask. Thomas returned to the casket, his movements cautious, as if afraid that approaching too quickly might shatter whatever fragile possibility had presented itself. Should we try to wake her?" he asked uncertainly, looking to Sebastian as if the photographer might have experience in such matters. Sebastian shook his head. "I think we should wait for the doctor. I'm no medical man, and attempting to rouse her ourselves might do more harm than good if she is indeed alive, but in some kind of catatonic state. But what if she's struggling to breathe in there? What if she's suffering?" The fear in Thomas's voice was palpable. Sebastian considered this, then approached the casket. With gentle hands, he adjusted Eleanor's position slightly, ensuring that nothing was constricting her throat or chest, on the chance that she was indeed still drawing breath. "The casket lid has been open since she was placed here," he said reassuringly. "If she is breathing, she's getting air, and Dr. Wilson will be here soon." The minutes that followed were the longest of Thomas Morton's life. He stood vigil beside his wife, watching for any sign of the movement that both he and Sebastian had witnessed. But Eleanor remained still, her face serene, giving no indication that she was anything other than what she appeared to be, a beautiful woman tragically taken before her time. Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed at the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, as if nature itself were protesting the unnatural situation unfolding within the Morton home. A particularly violent thunderclap rattled the windows, causing both men to start. In that same moment, a flash of lightning illuminated the room with stark white light, and in that brief instant, Thomas could have sworn he saw Eleanor's fingers twitch. "Did you see that?" he gasped, clutching Sebastian's arm. "Her hand moved!" Sebastian hadn't been looking at her hands, but the wild hope in Thomas's eyes was enough to convince him. "We need to document this," he said firmly. "If we're to convince Dr. Wilson, we need evidence." He returned to his camera, making rapid adjustments. "I'm going to take a series of photographs in quick succession," he explained. "If there is movement, no matter how slight, one of the images should capture it." Thomas nodded, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. "Hurry." Sebastian worked with the speed and precision born of years of experience. The storm actually worked to his advantage now, the frequent lightning providing bright flashes of illumination that allowed for shorter exposure times. He took image after image, the repetitive click of the shutter a counterpoint to the ticking of the clock and the rumble of thunder. Dr. Wilson arrived in a flurry of rainwater and confusion, his medical bag clutched tightly in one hand, his hat in the other. His greatcoat dripped onto the polished floor of the entryway as Higgins took it from him. "What's the meaning of this, Morton?" he demanded as the butler led him to the parlor. "I was in the middle of dinner. This had better be important." The doctor stopped short in the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Thomas standing vigil by the casket, Sebastian hunched over his camera, both men with an intensity of purpose that seemed at odds with what should have been the somber atmosphere of a wake. "What's going on here?" Dr. Wilson asked, his voice dropping to a more appropriate volume as he remembered the setting. Thomas gestured toward the casket. "It's Eleanor. We think, that is, Mr. Hart noticed." He faltered, suddenly aware of how preposterous it would sound. Sebastian stepped forward. "I was photographing Mrs. Morton, Doctor, and I observed movement in her right eyelid. Mr. Morton saw it as well, and he believes he saw her fingers move during the lightning flash just moments ago." Dr. Wilson's bushy eyebrows rose dramatically. He was a man in his 60s, with a reputation for being thorough and unsentimental, qualities that had earned him the respect of the community, if not their affection. He had been Ravenwood's primary physician for over 30 years, and had seen his fair share of tragedy and false hope. "Impossible," he said flatly. "I examined her myself. Death was confirmed nearly 48 hours ago. The body has been embalmed, for God's sake." "Actually," Thomas interjected, "we opted against embalming. Eleanor always said." He swallowed hard. She didn't like the idea of it. Dr. Wilson frowned at this. While embalming was becoming increasingly common, particularly among the upper classes, it was not yet universal. Still, a body dead for 2 days without preservation. "Nevertheless," Thomas said, finding his voice and his authority once more, "I insist that you examine her again, now." With a disapproving frown, Dr. Wilson approached the casket. He set his bag down on a nearby table and produced a stethoscope, which he placed against Eleanor's chest. The instrument gleamed dully in the lamplight, a symbol of medical authority that had pronounced countless lives begun and ended in Ravenwood. The room fell silent as the doctor listened intently, moving the instrument to different locations on Eleanor's torso. His frown deepened as the examination continued. He checked her pupils, holding an oil lamp close to her face and watching for any reaction. He felt for a pulse at her wrist and neck, his fingers pressing with practiced precision against the spots where life announced itself in rhythmic beats. After what seemed an eternity, he straightened up, his expression troubled. "Well?" Thomas demanded, unable to contain himself any longer. Dr. Wilson cleared his throat. "I can detect no heartbeat, no pulse, no respiration. By all medical standards, your wife remains deceased, Mr. Morton." Thomas's shoulders slumped. hope draining from his face as quickly as it had appeared. However, the doctor continued, his tone cautious. There is something unusual that I cannot immediately explain. What is it? Sebastian asked, stepping closer. There appears to be some minor muscular response when I test for reflexes. It's very slight, but it's there. And, he hesitated. I cannot be certain, but I believe I may have observed the same eyelid movement you described. Thomas gripped the edge of the casket, his knuckles white. What does it mean? Dr. Wilson shook his head slowly. I'm not sure. It could be post-mortem muscular spasms, though that would be unusual after this amount of time. Or what? Thomas pressed. Or we are dealing with a very rare case of catalepsy. Catalepsy? Sebastian repeated. What's that? It's a condition in which the body enters a state so resembling death that it can fool even experienced medical practitioners. Dr. Wilson explained, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The heartbeat and respiration slow to nearly imperceptible levels. The body becomes rigid, reflexes diminish, and consciousness appears to cease. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. Are you saying my wife might be alive? I'm saying it's a possibility we cannot entirely rule out, Dr. Wilson replied carefully. Cases of misdiagnosed death due to catalepsy are rare but not unheard of. There have been incidents. What kind of incidents? Sebastian asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Dr. Wilson's voice dropped to a near whisper. Premature burial. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, chilling the blood of both Thomas and Sebastian. The implications were too horrible to contemplate. Eleanor, conscious but paralyzed, placed in the ground, earth falling onto the casket. What do we do? Thomas asked, his voice hoarse with renewed fear. First, we must move her from the casket to a bed, Dr. Wilson said decisively. Then I'll apply more rigorous tests. If there's any life present, I intend to find it. Within minutes, the household was thrown into controlled chaos. Eleanor's body was carefully transferred to her bedroom upstairs, where Dr. Wilson could conduct a more thorough examination away from the funereal atmosphere of the parlor. The 4 strongest male servants carried her on a board, moving with exquisite care up the grand staircase. Eleanor was placed on the large 4-poster bed she had shared with Thomas for 12 years. The familiar surroundings, her silver-backed hairbrushes on the vanity, the framed watercolors she had painted on the walls, the vase of now wilting roses Thomas had brought her just before she fell ill, made the situation all the more surreal. This was a room meant for living, not for the ministrations of last resort on one presumed dead. Dr. Wilson ordered the room heated to a temperature that soon had the men shedding their jackets. Body heat is essential, he explained as he instructed servants to bring hot water bottles. If there is life present, it will need all the support we can give it. Word spread quickly through the house. Margaret, the 10-year-old daughter who had not spoken since her mother's passing, appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her eyes wide with confusion and fragile hope. Is Mama alive? She whispered, breaking her days-long silence. Thomas knelt before his daughter, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. We don't know yet, sweetheart. Dr. Wilson is doing everything he can to find out. I knew she wouldn't leave us, Margaret said with the simple conviction of a child. I prayed and prayed for her to come back. Thomas hugged his daughter tightly, fighting back tears. Over her shoulder, he exchanged a worried glance with Dr. Wilson. False hope could be crueler than grief itself. Margaret, why don't you go with Mrs. Higgins and look after your brother? He suggested gently. I'll come find you as soon as we know more. The child seemed reluctant to leave, but eventually allowed herself to be led away by the housekeeper, casting one last hopeful look at her mother's still form on the bed. After Margaret had been led away, Dr. Wilson continued his examination with renewed intensity. He applied hot compresses to Eleanor's skin, looking for any response to the heat. He administered smelling salts beneath her nose, watching for the slightest flare of her nostrils. He even employed a small electrical device of his own invention, designed to stimulate muscular response. This instrument delivers a very mild electrical current, he explained as he attached wires to Eleanor's arm. If there is any life present in the muscles, we should see a contraction. The room held its collective breath as the doctor activated the device. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Eleanor's fingers twitched. Did you see that? Thomas exclaimed, leaning forward eagerly. Dr. Wilson nodded, his scientific detachment momentarily broken by excitement. Indeed, a definite response. He moved the electrodes to different points on Eleanor's body, each time eliciting small but unmistakable movements. What does it mean? Sebastian asked, still documenting everything with his camera. It means that Mrs. Morton's muscles are still capable of responding to stimuli, the doctor replied. In a truly deceased person, this type of response would not be possible after 48 hours. So she is alive, Thomas pressed. Dr. Wilson held up a cautionary hand. I would not go that far yet. These could be isolated physiological responses in a body that is, for all other purposes, no longer living. But it does increase the likelihood that we are dealing with catalepsy rather than death. Hours passed. The storm outside intensified, beating against the windows like impatient fingers. Midnight came and went, marked only by the solemn chiming of the grandfather clock downstairs. Servants brought coffee and sandwiches, which went largely untouched as the vigil continued. Thomas had taken up position in a chair beside his wife's bed, his eyes never leaving her face. Sebastian remained as well, feeling somehow responsible for this strange turn of events, as if his camera had captured not just an image but something more, a truth that would otherwise have remained hidden. At one point, while Dr. Wilson was downstairs conferring with a colleague who had arrived to assist, Sebastian found himself alone with Thomas and Eleanor. The banker sat slumped in his chair, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. You should rest, sir, Sebastian suggested gently. I can watch over her for a while. Thomas shook his head. I left her side when she first fell ill. Went to the bank because there was an urgent matter that couldn't wait. When I returned, she was much worse. I won't leave her again. Sebastian nodded, understanding. She was fortunate to have your devotion. Was? Thomas looked up sharply. You speak as if she's already gone. Forgive me, Sebastian said quickly. A poor choice of words. They lapsed into silence, the only sounds the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional crackle of the fire that had been built up to keep the room warm. You know, Thomas said after a while, his voice taking on the dreamlike quality of the desperately exhausted. When I first met Eleanor, I thought she was the most alive person I'd ever encountered. She had this way of making every moment seem significant, every conversation important. She'd focus on you completely, as if nothing else in the world mattered in that moment. Sebastian nodded encouragingly, recognizing that Thomas needed to talk, needed to give voice to memories that suddenly seemed at risk of being buried forever. Our first meeting was at a summer garden party. I'd just moved to Ravenwood to take over the bank from my uncle. Didn't know a soul except him. Eleanor was playing croquet, laughing at something her friend had said. I remember thinking that her laugh was like sunlight breaking through clouds. Sounds poetic, doesn't it? I'm not usually given to such fancies. It's a beautiful description, Sebastian said softly. She saw me standing there looking completely out of place. And do you know what she did? She walked right over, handed me her mallet and said, You look like a man who knows his way around a croquet hoop. Thomas smiled at the memory. I'd never played croquet in my life, made a complete fool of myself, but she didn't seem to mind. The wistful smile faded from his face as he looked back at the still form on the bed. How can someone so full of life just stop? It doesn't make sense. Sebastian had no answer for that. Instead, he picked up his camera, focusing it on Eleanor's face. I'm going to take another photograph, he said. If there's been any change, the camera will capture it. Just as the clock struck 2 in the morning, Dr. Wilson returned with his colleague, Dr. Mercer, a younger physician with a reputation for embracing new medical theories. The two doctors conferred in low voices at the foot of the bed, occasionally casting glances at Eleanor that neither Thomas nor Sebastian could interpret. Finally, Dr. Wilson approached Thomas. Mr. Morton, he said quietly, I believe we need to discuss the possibility that what you and Mr. Hart observed was indeed post-mortem muscular activity. I've employed every test at my disposal, and I can find no concrete evidence of life, no heartbeat, no respiration, no consistent pupillary response. Thomas looked up, his face haggard with exhaustion and emotional turmoil. But you said yourself that catalepsy can mimic death so perfectly that even doctors can be fooled. Yes, but catalepsy doesn't typically last this long without some change in condition, Dr. Wilson explained. It's been 6 hours since we moved her, and there's been no discernible improvement. So you're saying we should give up? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Dr. Wilson sighed heavily. I'm saying we must face the possibility that your wife is truly gone, Mr. Morton. The funeral is scheduled for tomorrow. The community is expecting to pay their final respects. I don't give a damn what the community expects, Thomas snapped, rising from his chair. If there's even the slightest chance that Eleanor is alive, I won't allow her to be buried. Thomas, Dr. Wilson said, using his first name for the first time in years. "I understand your reluctance, but we must be rational." "Rational?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "What's rational about putting my wife in the ground if she might still be alive? What's rational about the fact that if Mr. Hart hadn't noticed that movement, we would have proceeded with the funeral tomorrow without a second thought? How many others have we buried who weren't truly dead, Doctor? How many?" The accusation hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. Dr. Wilson's face flushed, but he maintained his professional composure. "The medical profession takes every precaution." "Every precaution wasn't enough for Eleanor, was it?" Thomas interrupted. "If not for a photographer's keen eye, we would never have known." Sebastian, who had been silent for most of the examination, suddenly spoke up. "What if we postpone the funeral, just for a day or two? If there's no change in her condition, then at least we'll know we did everything possible." Dr. Wilson frowned, considering this proposal. A delay of 24 hours might be acceptable. Any longer than that, and, well, the preservation of the body becomes a concern, especially given that Mrs. Morton was not embalmed. Thomas flinched at the clinical way the doctor referred to Eleanor, but he nodded in agreement with Sebastian's suggestion. "One day then. We'll wait one more day." As dawn broke over Ravenwood, news spread through town that the Morton funeral had been postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Speculation ran wild. Everything from financial troubles to family disputes was suggested as the reason for the delay. None guessed the truth, that in the stately home on Willow Street, a vigil was being kept over a woman who might not be dead after all. Throughout that day, Eleanor's condition remained unchanged. Dr. Wilson and Dr. Mercer continued their tests, becoming increasingly convinced that what they were observing were indeed post-mortem reactions, rather than signs of life. But Thomas refused to accept their conclusions, clinging to the hope that had been kindled by Sebastian's observation. There was a case in France, Dr. Mercer mentioned during a quiet moment when Thomas had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was sleeping in a chair beside the bed. A young woman declared dead, only to awaken at her own funeral. Caused quite a sensation in the medical journals. Lazarus syndrome, Dr. Wilson nodded. Exceedingly rare, but documented, though in those cases there is usually a return of vital signs within hours, not days. Sebastian, who had gone home briefly to rest but returned in the afternoon, drawn by a mixture of professional curiosity and personal concern, listened to this exchange with interest. He had brought with him his camera equipment, thinking that documenting any changes might be helpful. "Do you mind if I take some photographs?" he asked the doctors tentatively. "It might help you if you could see any subtle changes over time." Dr. Wilson nodded wearily. "Yes, if you think it might help, though I fear we are grasping at straws at this point." Sebastian set up his equipment by the window, where the late afternoon light provided the best illumination. As he focused his camera on Eleanor's still form, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. Hadn't it been just yesterday that he'd stood in the parlor, preparing to photograph what he believed was a corpse? He captured several images, carefully documenting Eleanor's appearance from different angles. After each exposure, he would develop the plate immediately in a makeshift darkroom he'd set up in the adjoining bathroom, eager to see if the camera might reveal something that the human eye had missed. It was during the development of his third plate that Sebastian noticed something odd. As the image slowly appeared in the chemical bath, he peered closely at Eleanor's face. There, in the photograph, her eyes appeared to be open slightly, just a sliver, but definitely open. He rushed back to the bedroom, plate in hand, still dripping with chemicals. "Dr. Wilson, Mr. Morton," he called urgently. "Look at this." Thomas, who had been dozing in his chair, jerked awake. The doctors hurried over, and Sebastian held up the wet plate for them to see. "Her eyes," Thomas whispered. "They're open." Both doctors leaned in, examining the plate with professional scrutiny. "Interesting," Dr. Mercer murmured. "Very interesting indeed." All four men turned to look at Eleanor on the bed. Her eyes remained closed, just as they had been since she was prepared for her funeral. "I don't understand," Thomas said, looking back at the photograph. "How can they be open in the picture but closed in reality?" Sebastian shook his head, equally baffled. "I don't know, but I'm going to take another photograph right now." He quickly set up his camera again, focusing carefully on Eleanor's face. This time, all four men watched her intently as Sebastian triggered the shutter. Nothing happened. Eleanor remained perfectly still, her eyes firmly closed. When Sebastian developed this new plate, it showed her exactly as they had seen her. eyes closed, face serene. It doesn't make sense, Sebastian muttered, comparing the two plates side by side. Unless what? Thomas demanded. Unless her eyes were open for just a split second, exactly when I took the earlier photograph. The camera captured something too brief for us to see with the naked eye. The doctors exchanged glances, clearly skeptical but unable to completely dismiss the evidence before them. It could be a flaw in the development process, Dr. Wilson suggested. A bubble in the chemical bath that happened to form near the eye area of the image. That doesn't explain the electrical responses we've been getting, Dr. Mercer pointed out, or the reflexive movements. Thomas returned to his wife's side, taking her hand in his. Eleanor? Eleanor, can you hear me? If you can hear me, try to open your eyes again. The room fell silent as all four men watched and waited. Seconds stretched into minutes with no response. We need to be methodical about this, Dr. Wilson said finally. Mr. Hart, can you take a series of photographs in rapid succession? If there are intermittent movements occurring, that might give us a better chance of capturing them. Sebastian nodded and began preparing his equipment for a sequence of exposures. As he worked, the door to the bedroom creaked open slightly, and a small face peered around it. Margaret, Thomas said, surprised to see his daughter. You should be with Mrs. Higgins. I sneaked away, the girl admitted, entering the room fully. I wanted to see Mama. Thomas went to his daughter, kneeling to her level. We're still trying to help her, sweetheart. Margaret looked past her father to where Sebastian stood with the photographic plates. What are those? Sebastian hesitated, looking to Thomas for guidance. These images of a seemingly dead woman might be disturbing to a child. Thomas nodded slightly. She's stronger than you might think. Sebastian knelt as well, holding up the plate that showed Eleanor with her eyes partially open. See here, Miss Margaret. This is a picture I took of your mother just a little while ago. Margaret studied the image solemnly. Her eyes are open a little bit, she observed, like when she peeks during hide-and-seek to see if I'm coming. Thomas and Sebastian exchanged glances over the child's head. That's right, Thomas said gently. We think Mama might be trying to wake up, but it's very hard for her right now. Margaret approached her mother's bedside, still clutching her porcelain doll that she'd brought with her. Mama, it's me. You don't have to hide anymore. We found you. The innocence and simplicity of the child's words brought tears to Thomas's eyes. Sebastian discreetly wiped at his own face, pretending to adjust his camera. Mr. Morton, he said quietly, I'd like to try something, if you'll permit it. Thomas nodded, curious. Margaret, would you keep talking to your mother? Sebastian suggested. I'm going to take more pictures while you do. The little girl nodded solemnly and proceeded to tell her mother about her day, how she'd helped Mrs. Higgins make biscuits, how baby James had tried to eat a butterfly in the garden, how she'd been practicing her piano lessons just as her mother had taught her. And James drew you a picture, she continued, her small voice filling the room. It's mostly just scribbles because he's only 4, but Mrs. Higgins says it looks like a flower. I think it looks more like a spider, but we told him it was beautiful anyway. As Margaret chattered, Sebastian took a series of photographs, one after another, developing each plate immediately before returning to take the next. By the 6th photograph, they had their answer. Look, Sebastian said, his voice hushed with awe as he held up the latest plate. Her eyes are definitely open now, and look at her mouth. It's different too. Indeed, in the photograph, Eleanor's lips appeared to be parted slightly, as if she were trying to speak. Thomas stared at the image, then back at his wife. To his naked eye, she remained unchanged, eyes closed, lips together. What does it mean? He asked, his voice raw with emotion. Why can't we see these changes ourselves? I don't know, Sebastian admitted. But the camera doesn't lie, Mr. Morton. Something is happening, even if it's happening too subtly or too quickly for us to perceive. Dr. Wilson and Dr. Mercer examined the plates with growing excitement, their earlier skepticism giving way to scientific curiosity. This is unprecedented, Dr. Mercer declared. The camera is capturing physiological changes that occur too rapidly for human perception. It's as if Mrs. Morton is trying to break through from whatever state she's in, but can only manage momentary success. Is there anything we can do to help her? Thomas asked desperately. Any way to reach her? The doctors conferred quietly. Then Dr. Wilson turned to Thomas. There are experimental treatments for catalepsy. Electrical stimulation has shown some promise, as have certain pharmaceutical approaches, but they are not without risk. What kind of risk? Thomas demanded. If Mrs. Morton is indeed in a cataleptic state, attempting to force her out of it too abruptly could cause shock to the system. The brain and body must be handled with extreme care in such cases. Margaret, who had been quietly stroking her mother's hand throughout this conversation, looked up suddenly. "Music," she said. "Mama always wakes up for music." The adults exchanged glances, surprised by the child's interjection. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Thomas asked gently. "When Mama takes her afternoon nap, and you need her to wake up for visitors, you always play the piano really loud," Margaret explained matter-of-factly. "And she always wakes up, even when she's very tired." Thomas stared at his daughter for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She's right. Eleanor loves music. It's always been a part of her life. It's worth trying," Dr. Mercer conceded. "Strong sensory stimuli can sometimes break through a cataleptic state, and music engages multiple areas of the brain simultaneously. Better yet," Dr. Wilson added, warming to the idea, "it poses no physical risk to the patient." Without further discussion, Thomas led them all downstairs to the formal parlor, where a grand piano stood in the corner, the same room where Eleanor's casket had been displayed just yesterday. The symbolism was lost on no one, least of all Thomas, who hesitated before entering the room, memories of yesterday's wake still fresh in his mind. "Who will play?" Sebastian asked, looking around the group. "I will," Thomas said firmly, seating himself at the bench. "I'm not as accomplished as Eleanor, but she taught me enough." His fingers hesitated over the keys for just a moment before he began to play, a Chopin nocturne that had always been his wife's favorite. The melancholy notes filled the room, drifting up the staircase toward the bedroom where Eleanor lay. As the final chords faded away, they all looked at each other, uncertainty written on their faces. Had it worked? Was there any change? "Play something else, Papa," Margaret urged. "Something louder. Something happier." Thomas nodded and launched into a more vigorous piece, a lively waltz that Eleanor had often played during their evening gatherings. His fingers flew over the keys with greater confidence now, the music swelling through the house, passionate and insistent. Sebastian had brought his camera downstairs and was preparing to return to the bedroom to check for any changes, when a startled cry from upstairs froze them all in place. It was Mrs. Higgins, who had gone to check on Eleanor while the others were downstairs. Her voice echoed down the stairwell, a mixture of terror and amazement that sent them all rushing from the parlor, taking the stairs two at a time in their haste. "What is it? What's happened?" Thomas demanded as they burst into the bedroom. Mrs. Higgins pointed wordlessly at Eleanor. Her eyes were open, fully open now, no longer the mere slit that had been captured in Sebastian's photographs. She was staring at the ceiling, blinking slowly, as if awakening from a very deep sleep. "Eleanor?" Thomas whispered, approaching the bed cautiously, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this miracle. "Eleanor, can you hear me?" Her eyes moved slowly, tracking toward the sound of his voice. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. "Get her some water," Dr. Wilson ordered, moving quickly to the bedside. He took her wrist in his fingers, feeling for a pulse. "It's there," he announced, his professional composure cracking slightly to reveal genuine amazement. Weak, but definitely present, and regular. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, taking his wife's hand in his. "Eleanor, you're safe. You're home. Can you squeeze my hand if you understand me?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, ever so slightly, Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. A sob escaped Thomas's throat, a sound of pure relief and joy. Margaret climbed onto the bed, wrapping her small arms around her mother's neck. "I told you she was just hiding," the child said triumphantly. Sebastian captured the moment with his camera, knowing instinctively that this was an image the family would treasure forever, not as a memorial of death, but as a celebration of life reclaimed from the very brink of eternity. Over the next several hours, Eleanor's condition improved steadily. Her breathing became more regular, her pulse stronger. By evening, she was able to take small sips of water and broth. By midnight, she could whisper a few words, though full speech seemed beyond her capabilities for now. "Rest," was Dr. Wilson's prescription. "Her body has been through an ordeal we can barely comprehend. She needs time to recover her strength." The doctors remained with the family, monitoring Eleanor's progress with a mixture of professional interest and personal relief. Dr. Wilson in particular seemed deeply affected by the turn of events. He had nearly signed a death certificate for a living woman, a mistake that would have haunted him for the rest of his career had it not been for Sebastian Hart's careful observation. "It's quite extraordinary," he told Thomas and Sebastian as they shared a late-night brandy in the study. "In all my years of practice, I've never witnessed such a profound case of catalepsy. By all conventional medical standards, she was dead. What caused it? Thomas asked, the relief of Eleanor's awakening now giving way to concern about the future. How did this happen to her? Dr. Wilson sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. It's difficult to say with certainty. Catalepsy can be triggered by various conditions: severe trauma, certain types of fevers, disorders of the nervous system. In Mrs. Morton's case, I suspect her illness may have induced the state. Will it happen again? Sebastian inquired, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at Thomas all evening. It's possible, the doctor admitted. Once a person has experienced catalepsy, they may be more susceptible to future episodes. But now that we're aware of the possibility, we'll be vigilant. Thomas drained his glass, setting it down with a decisive thump. I won't bury my wife until I'm absolutely certain she's gone, he declared. And even then, I'll want safeguards. Dr. Wilson nodded understandingly. There are measures that can be taken. Safety coffins have been developed with bells or flags that can be triggered from within. Some families opt for a waiting period in a mortuary receiving vault before final interment. Sebastian, who had been lost in thought, suddenly spoke up. What if we used photography, regular photographs, to document any changes, no matter how subtle? An interesting proposition, Dr. Wilson mused. A scientific approach to death verification. It might have applications beyond this case. As the men discussed these possibilities, a soft tapping at the door interrupted them. It was Mrs. Higgins. "Begging your pardon, sir," she said to Thomas, "but Mrs. Morton is asking for you. She seems quite distressed." Thomas was on his feet immediately, hurrying up the stairs to his wife's bedside. He found Eleanor agitated, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to form words that wouldn't come. "Shh," he soothed, taking her hand. "Don't strain yourself. You're safe now." She shook her head frantically, clearly desperate to communicate something. "Wait, let me fetch something to write with," Thomas said, suddenly understanding. He quickly procured a small slate and chalk from Margaret's schoolroom. Eleanor's hand trembled as she took the chalk, but her writing, though shaky, was legible. "I heard everything." Thomas stared at the words, a chill running down his spine. "You were conscious? The whole time?" She nodded, tears filling her eyes. She wiped the slate clean and wrote again. "Couldn't move, couldn't speak, trapped. Oh, my darling," Thomas whispered, gathering her gently in his arms. "What a nightmare you've endured." Eleanor pulled back slightly, determined to write more. "Saw my funeral, saw my coffin, heard the plans for burial." Thomas held her as she wept, her body racked with the horror of her experience. To be aware, to hear the preparations for your own burial, to lie helpless as you were mourned and prepared for the grave. It was a terror beyond imagination. When Dr. Wilson and Sebastian were summoned to the bedroom, Eleanor had calmed somewhat. She was able to answer simple questions with nods or by writing brief responses on the slate. "This confirms it was indeed catalepsy," Dr. Wilson said after examining her. "A rare presentation where consciousness remains while voluntary motor control is almost entirely lost. Fascinating from a medical perspective, though undoubtedly horrifying for the patient." Eleanor scrawled on her slate, "Not patient, prisoner." Dr. Wilson had the grace to look abashed. "Of course. Forgive my clinical detachment, Mrs. Morton. You've survived an ordeal few could comprehend." As dawn approached, Eleanor finally fell into a natural sleep, not the death-like trance that had nearly condemned her to a premature grave, but the healing slumber her body desperately needed. Thomas remained by her side, unwilling to leave even for a moment, as if his presence alone could anchor her to life. The news spread quickly through Ravenwood the next day. Eleanor Morton, supposedly dead and awaiting burial, had miraculously awakened. Some called it a resurrection, others a medical marvel. Many whispered of divine intervention, while a few darker voices muttered about unnatural forces. For the Morton family, the explanation mattered less than the simple joy of having Eleanor back among them. Margaret became her mother's constant companion, refusing to leave her side for fear she might go away again. Little James, too young to understand what had happened, nevertheless seemed to sense the shift in the household's atmosphere from grief back to life. Sebastian Hart found himself unexpectedly celebrated for his role in the discovery. His photography business flourished as word spread of how his camera had captured what the human eye could not. Families now requested his services specifically, hopeful that his keen eye and skilled camera work might provide the same assurance for their loved ones. In the weeks that followed, as Eleanor gradually regained her strength and her voice, she and Sebastian formed an unusual friendship. She was eager to understand exactly how his camera had seen what others could not, and he was fascinated by her experience of being conscious, yet appearing dead. It was like being buried alive while still on the surface, she told him one afternoon as they sat in the garden. Her speech had returned, though her voice remained softer than before, with a slight rasp that Dr. Wilson assured her would eventually fade. I could hear everything, the mourners, the prayers, the sound of my own children crying for me, but I couldn't reach them. What was the first moment you realized what was happening? Sebastian asked gently. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, summoning the memory. It was when Dr. Wilson declared me dead. I heard him say it, and I thought, no, that's wrong. I'm still here, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even open my eyes properly. Were you aware of the moment when I first noticed your eyelid moving? She nodded. I felt your presence near the casket. I was trying so hard to signal somehow to anyone who might notice. When you left suddenly, I feared you had missed it, that my one chance at rescue had passed. Sebastian shuddered at the thought. If I had dismissed it as imagination, but you didn't, Eleanor said, touching his hand briefly in gratitude. You saw what no one else could see. You gave me back my life. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Wilson, who had been making regular visits to check on Eleanor's recovery. Today, however, he wasn't alone. With him was a distinguished-looking gentleman in a well-tailored suit. Mrs. Morton, Mr. Hart, Dr. Wilson greeted them. May I present Dr. Lawrence Ashford from Baltimore? He's a specialist in neurological disorders and has taken a particular interest in your case. Dr. Ashford bowed slightly. Mrs. Morton, I cannot express what an honor it is to meet you. Your experience may help advance our understanding of catalepsy and similar conditions immeasurably. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Am I to be a medical curiosity then? Not at all, Dr. Ashford assured her quickly. But your case is remarkable, particularly because you remained conscious throughout. Most cataleptic patients report no awareness during their episodes. Lucky me, Eleanor said dryly. Dr. Ashford smiled, appreciating her spirit. Indeed, but your experience, combined with Mr. Hart's photographic documentation, presents an unprecedented opportunity for study. With your permission, I'd like to publish a paper on your case. Eleanor exchanged glances with Sebastian. And what of others who might be in similar circumstances? How many have been buried alive because no one noticed what Mr. Hart noticed? Dr. Ashford's expression grew somber. That is precisely why your case is so important, Mrs. Morton. If we can establish better protocols for confirming death, perhaps incorporating photography as Mr. Hart suggests, we might prevent such tragedies. Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Very well, she said finally, but on one condition. I want to be involved in your work, not merely its subject. I want to help prevent anyone else from experiencing what I did. Dr. Ashford blinked in surprise. Women were not typically involved in medical research, particularly not as collaborators rather than subjects. But something in Eleanor's steady gaze suggested that conventional objections would be futile. I would welcome your insight, he said, earning himself a look of disapproval from Dr. Wilson. In the months that followed, Eleanor threw herself into this new purpose with remarkable energy. Her near-death experience had changed her, giving her a fierce determination to make her second chance at life meaningful. The frail society woman who had once occupied herself with charity balls and afternoon teas was gone, replaced by a woman of purpose who cared little for the raised eyebrows and whispered comments her new activities generated. Together with Sebastian Hart and Dr. Ashford, she helped develop a new protocol for death verification that incorporated photography. Sebastian's camera would capture images of the deceased at regular intervals, looking for subtle changes that might indicate life rather than death. They called it the Morton Protocol, and it quickly gained attention in medical circles across the country. Eleanor herself spoke at medical conferences, a scandal in some quarters, a sensation in others, describing her experience from the unique perspective of one who had been declared dead while still conscious. Imagine, she would say to audiences of rapt physicians, if your colleague had not simply signed a death certificate, but had instead taken the time to look more deeply, more carefully, how many lives might have been saved? How many horrors prevented? Her advocacy led to reforms in funeral practices, including longer waiting periods before burial, and the increased use of safety coffins equipped with bells or air tubes, precautions against premature interment that had existed but had often been dismissed as unnecessary. For Sebastian Hart, the events of that strange funeral in 1911 marked a turning point in his career. No longer just a portrait photographer documenting the milestones of Ravenwood citizens, he became known as a pioneer in medical photography. His techniques for capturing subtle physiological changes were studied and adopted by hospitals across the nation. "You found your true calling," Eleanor told him one day as they reviewed a new series of photographs taken at Ravenwood's small hospital. "You see things that others miss." Sebastian smiled at her. "As have you, Mrs. Morton. Who would have thought that your brush with death would lead to saving so many lives?" Eleanor's gaze turned distant for a moment. "When I was lying in that casket, hearing my own funeral being planned around me, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I somehow escaped that fate, I would ensure no one else suffered as I had. It seems a small price to pay for a second chance at life." As years passed, the Morton Protocol became standard practice in hospitals and mortuaries throughout the country. Safety coffins, once considered a novelty born of superstition, became commonplace for families who could afford them. The medical community gradually accepted the reality that death was not always as clear-cut as previously believed. The line between life and death, once thought to be a sharp demarcation, was now understood to be more of a penumbra, a shadowy border region where consciousness might linger, even as the body appeared to have surrendered to eternity. In 1918, during the influenza pandemic that swept the globe, the Morton Protocol saved scores of lives. In the chaos of mass casualties, many victims fell into cataleptic states that mimicked death. But thanks to the protocol established by Eleanor and her colleagues, these individuals were given time for their bodies to recover, time for life to reassert itself. Eleanor and Thomas Morton remained in Ravenwood, where their story had become part of the town's proud heritage. Their children grew up with a unique perspective on life and death. Margaret eventually followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming an advocate for medical reform in her own right, while James inherited his father's business acumen and expanded the bank's operations throughout the state. Sebastian Hart's photographs of Eleanor, both those taken when she appeared dead and those documenting her recovery, were preserved in medical archives, studied by generations of physicians as visual evidence of how easily life could mimic death, and how important it was never to mistake one for the other. In 1925, 14 years after her near burial, Eleanor faced her greatest fear. She contracted pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter, and for several days her family feared history might repeat itself. But this time, they were prepared. Sebastian, now an elderly man but still sharp-eyed behind his camera, maintained a photographic vigil, capturing images every hour to ensure that if Eleanor slipped into catalepsy again, it would be detected immediately. She recovered, though the illness left her weaker than before. "I thought I might join you in your photographic immortality," she joked weakly to Sebastian when she was well enough for visitors. "But it seems I'm destined to remain firmly on this side of the camera for now." In 1930, Thomas Morton passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving Eleanor a widow. His funeral was conducted with all the precautions the Morton Protocol prescribed, though there was never any doubt about the finality of his passing. Eleanor sat beside his casket, a quiet smile on her face as she remembered their life together, a life that had nearly been cut short 19 years earlier. "He gave me back my life twice," she told Sebastian at the wake. "First when he married me and gave me a reason to live beyond the confines society had planned for me, and then again when he refused to let me be buried." Sebastian, now stooped with age, his hands gnarled with arthritis but still capable of operating his beloved camera, nodded in understanding. He was a man of great courage and conviction. "As are you, my friend," Eleanor said, taking his weathered hand in hers. "Never forget that your eyes saw what others missed. Your camera captured what others couldn't perceive. Without you, I would be nothing but dust and bones beneath the earth by now." It was a sobering thought, one that had haunted both of them over the years. How close Eleanor had come to being buried alive, how easily her fate might have been sealed if not for a chance observation, a moment of doubt, a refusal to accept what seemed obvious to everyone else. Sebastian Hart died in 1935, his passing marking the end of an era in Ravenwood. Eleanor arranged for his camera, the same one that had captured her fateful blinking in 1911, to be donated to the Smithsonian Institution, along with the photographs that had changed medical history. Eleanor herself lived to see the dawn of World War II, her mind remaining sharp even as her body gradually surrendered to age. She died peacefully in 1942, at the age of 63, a full 31 years after she had nearly been buried alive. Her funeral was attended by medical professionals from across the country, all of whom had been influenced by the Morton Protocol. In accordance with her wishes, her casket remained open for 3 days before burial, during which time a photographer took regular images of her face, looking for any signs of life. There were none, of course. This time, death had come in truth, not merely in appearance. But the precaution itself stood as a testament to Eleanor's legacy, a legacy of caution, of looking more deeply, of never taking death at face value. In hospitals and homes across America and beyond, people who might once have been declared dead and consigned to the grave were given time. Time for a camera to capture an almost imperceptible blink. Time for a loved one to notice a subtle change. Time for life to reassert itself in bodies that only seemed to have surrendered to death. And in each of these cases, though they never knew it, they owed their second chance to a woman named Eleanor Morton, who had heard her own funeral and lived to tell the tale. As for the town of Ravenwood, it preserved the story of the Morton funeral as part of its local lore. Tour guides would point out the stately Victorian on Willow Street, telling visitors about the woman who awoke from death's embrace, saved by a photographer's keen eye and a camera that saw what humans could not. And they say, the guides would add in hushed tones, that on certain nights if you pass by the old Morton place, you might catch a glimpse of a light in the upstairs window, the room where Eleanor Morton returned to life. Some claim it's just a reflection of the moonlight on the glass. Others say it's her spirit, keeping watch to ensure that no one else suffers the fate she so narrowly escaped. Whether true or not, the legend served its purpose, reminding each generation of Ravenwood's citizens that death isn't always what it seems, and that life, real life, can hide in the smallest movements, the briefest moments, waiting for someone who cares enough to notice. In 1956, long after both Eleanor and Sebastian had passed away, confirmed by the protocol they had helped establish, a young medical student discovered their story in a dusty archive. Fascinated, he tracked down Margaret Morton, by then an elderly woman with grandchildren of her own. "What's the most important thing you learned from your mother's experience?" he asked her during their interview. Margaret thought for a moment, her aged face reflecting the wisdom of decades. "That appearances can be deceiving," she said finally, "and that sometimes it takes only one person willing to question what everyone else accepts as truth to change the course of history." The student went on to become a leading neurologist, specializing in disorders of consciousness. Throughout his distinguished career, he kept a framed copy of Sebastian Hart's photograph, the one that captured Eleanor Morton's blinking eyes, on his office wall. When asked about it, he would simply say, "It reminds me to look more carefully, to see what others might miss." And so the legacy continued, passed from generation to generation, a legacy born in a quiet moment in 1911, when a photographer peered through his camera and noticed something impossible, something miraculous, something that changed medical history forever: a dead woman blinking. In the modern era, the Morton Protocol evolved with technology. Digital cameras replaced Sebastian's plate camera, and sophisticated monitoring equipment measured brain activity, heart function, and oxygen levels, with precision unimaginable in Eleanor's time. But the fundamental principle remained the same. Death requires verification beyond a casual glance, beyond a simple pronouncement. Life can linger in the shadows, can hide behind closed eyelids, can wait in silence for someone to notice its faint, persistent presence. And somewhere, perhaps, Eleanor Morton's spirit watches over those who might otherwise be lost, those who linger in that liminal space between life and death, waiting for someone to see them, to hear them, to recognize that they are still there, still present, still deserving of one more chance at life, just as she was on that rainy afternoon in 1911, when a photographer noticed a dead woman blinking.